Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Lewis, and I'm the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad you joined us today. Now I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Melanie Beals Goan. Dr. Goan is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Kentucky. She is originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, but she's lived in Kentucky since 1994. She earned a BA in History from Slippery Rock University and an MA and PhD from the University of Kentucky. Her research interest and teaching focus include 20th century US history, Kentucky history, gender, and the history of healthcare. In 2008, she published Mary Breckinridge, the Frontier Nursing Service and Rural Health in Appalachia with the University of North Carolina Press. And the University Press of Kentucky published her newest book, A Simple Justice, Kentucky Women and the Suffrage Movement in 2020. I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Goan and then rejoin her after the presentation to moderate questions as time permits.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to join you today. We've moved into 2021, but 2020 was the big year for the suffrage movement and our remembering that movement and the big milestone that occurred 100 years ago with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So I think we're planning to extend our celebration a little into this next year, considering that a lot of the things we had planned, the excitement surrounding that milestone got overshadowed a bit. So we want to continue to give this anniversary the attention that it deserves. Now, one thing we didn't see the parades, we didn't see the events to celebrate suffrage, but we did see a wave of new scholarship come out last year. And my book was one of those new pieces of scholarship that emerged in 2020. And I was really grateful that it did come out in 2020. I got it done in time. I would have been pretty disappointed if I would have missed the celebrating that came in that year. So I want to share with you about my book today and about the Kentucky suffrage movement. And I will say Kentucky is not the first place that we think of when we think of women gaining the right to vote. We might think of New York, we might think of Tennessee, the last state to ratify. But one thing I think you will see as I talk today, you will notice how important Kentucky was to this movement and some of the backstories of women and men who were involved in this movement. So I'm going to share that with you today. So there's the cover of my book. And let me say something first about the title. And titles for me are always one of the hardest parts of writing a book, to come up with something that's succinct, that encapsulates what the book is about. And this title was part of a collaboration, UK Press, me, together, we finally settled on this title. And I really like it a lot because this title works on two levels to describe this movement in Kentucky and Kentucky's women's participation. On the one hand, it gets at the heart of the matter, the idea shared by most suffragists that the vote for women was a simple justice. Women were tired of being grouped together with children and criminals and how they were known at the time, lunatics, people that weren't trusted with the vote. Women believed that justice dictated that they have a say in American politics as well. Many of these women that were involved in the suffrage movement were very religious, and so they shared a belief that God created humans with the power to reason, and that women should be allowed to use that reason to benefit society. But I also like this title because it works on another level. And in this way, we might add a question mark to it. This idea that the vote was a simple justice, suffragists said this, but one wonders if they really believed it thoroughly. They insisted that the vote was a fundamental right, but When they started thinking about it, extending it to all women, some of them took a pause. And what we see in this movement is race and gender intersecting in ways that make the suffrage movement anything but simple. There was a good reason it took over 7 decades for women to gain the vote. If it were as simple as this title suggests, they probably would have achieved that goal more quickly. So this title helps us think about the suffrage movement on multiple levels. When we think of women getting the right to vote, our minds, I think, naturally go to the 19th Amendment. We see it as an endpoint, and this commemorative stamp here, the publicity around it, in fact, suggests that the fight for women's suffrage had been won when the 19th Amendment was ratified. August 26, 1920, a banner date. We celebrate it every year still as Women's Equality Day. And we think of it as a magic endpoint, this one shining moment when women's aspirations were reached. But that's a little too simple. And if we look at this movement, we have to understand that the 19th Amendment was a culmination of many years of women in piecemeal fashion gaining the right to vote, but it also wasn't an endpoint. In many ways, it was a beginning point. But let me stress here, women, many of them across the country, are voting long before 1920. And you can see this map. I like this map. It was one that suffragists used often. They would update this map every year or so to show the victories that had been won. And with its complicated color shading, it tells us a lot here. We can look and see that women, like I said, well before 1920, are gaining the vote. What it doesn't show, the earliest women in the country, actually, this is happening for New Jersey women in the 1790s. Between 1790 and 1807, women in New Jersey are actually voting in presidential elections. That right is going to be repealed. Same thing is something similar is happening in Kentucky. Kentucky is actually the second state in the country to grant women the right to vote. Now, it's only in limited circumstances. And you might imagine, okay, well, how can we envision women in Kentucky getting this right to vote? It's not in presidential elections. It's not in state elections, school elections. Starting in 1837, Kentucky women can vote in school elections if they're meeting certain criteria. Now that right, again, will be revoked and then has to be regained over time. Here in 1919, if you look at the shading, you look at Kentucky and the key down there, Kentucky women had the right to vote in school elections in 1919. But in New York, 1917, New York women had gained their full voting rights. So this patchwork, piecemeal way that women gain their rights. This helps us understand how it could be that Jeanette Rankin is serving in the US House in 1920. Even as some women still can't vote, we have female legislators. And so this is a process that unfolds over time. Now, I said not all women are gaining the right to vote in 1920, and many are still not going to be able to vote for many years to come. Women of color particularly do not share in this victory that happens in 1920. And it's going to take until 1965, the Voting Rights Act, before Black women in any large numbers have the right to vote. But not just Black women, you have Asian immigrant women, you have Native American women, even white native-born women lose the right to vote if they marry foreign-born men for a time after 1920. And so this is not a switch that gets flipped here. We have to be aware of this process. So I want to start Kentucky's story with this iconic image here, a very famous photo. We see this image a lot because we don't have a lot of good images of Kentucky suffragists in more than just individual portraits. So this picture has been very valuable as we remember what the suffrage movement here looked like. This image depicts a milestone for Kentucky women because Kentucky is going to be one of the states, one of the 36 states needed to ratify the amendment, and will do so in January of 1920. So you can see here, the governor of the state, Edwin Morrow, is there in the center, and women look on as he signs in a ceremonial way Kentucky's ratification. This was a great victory because it happened on the first day of the legislative session. It really took a lot of effort on the part of suffragists to get that through, but they wanted the symbolism of passing it on the very first day. Now, I love this picture for many reasons. One is that it reveals so much about the era in which it was taken. If you look very closely, here I'll zoom in, you can see the signs of the time. And so you can see on the governor's desk a telephone, the new technology that's entering the workplace. You can see the electric lines that are strung from the ceiling because electricity is relatively new and powering the lamp there on his desk. You can notice the fan in the background. And I always remind students how hot the summers got in Kentucky. And in an era where you didn't have air conditioning, everywhere you went, you saw these fans to cool things down. You can see the women dressed in their finery there, their sashes and the pennants and the flags and the symbolism of the suffrage movement they're carrying into this event. Their hats are wonderful as well. Now, we can see a lot of individual women included in this picture. And this was one thing I struggled with, other historians. You would figure a picture of as important as this would have been well labeled, but it turned out it wasn't. And so we had to identify a lot of these women very painstakingly, trying to match them up with other photos we found elsewhere. And we were able to do that. We've added a lot of the names to these women, put names with faces. And so we can look at some of these women here. I'll point to Catherine Morrow, the wife of the governor. She was a suffragist and she's peering over his shoulder, kind of looks like she's breathing down his neck there a little bit. You see Madeline McDowell Breckinridge next to her. And Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, a well-known figure in Kentucky's history. She's a consummate progressive reformer. She's interested in all kinds of causes, wants to change society for the better, and really feels like she has to have the vote to do that. In this picture, we have women from all over the state, not just central Kentucky, where Madeline McDowell Breckinridge is coming from, but other parts of the state as well. And a lot of these women here are from Louisville, so I'll point to a couple of them as well. And let me just note that if they had taken a group picture of Kentucky suffragists even 10 years before this, you wouldn't have seen this number of Louisville women because Louisville was really kind of late to the party. Louisville, the suffrage movement there gets off to a very slow start. And it's not until the 1913s that Louisville women really get mobilized and involved. But we have here Caroline Leach, a club woman, a Louisville woman. I'll point to Margaret Castleman and Alice Castleman, some names that are well known in Louisville history. If I look at this picture, one thing I notice is all of these women are white. The Kentucky suffrage movement will be all white. Most of these women are middle-aged. They're fairly well-to-do. Most of them, I said, are religious. And most of them are Christian, but not all of them are Christian. So I'll point to another Louisville woman here, that also stands out, an interesting story. Rebecca Judah, there toward the center. She was Jewish, an officer in the National Council of Jewish Women, officer with the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. She was treasurer for a number of years. So we have a little religious diversity here, but a pretty homogeneous organization. This picture is important for who is in it, but also who is not in it. In some cases, we have really influential suffragists who are not here because they didn't live to see this victory. And Susan Look Avery here, her portrait, the Women's Club of Louisville has this hanging on display. Susan Look Avery, a remarkable story. She comes to suffrage and reform work very late in her life, but was incredibly energetic. She was also more willing to accept racial diversity and to champion the rights of Black women than a lot of her peers. But she dies before the suffrage movement culminates. So she's not in this picture. There's one other very important person that's missing from the shot. And if you know anything about the Kentucky suffrage movement, this omission is really kind of jolting and glaring. And that's the absence of Laura Clay here. Now, most people, if I talk to them and ask them what they know about Kentucky suffrage, this is the one name that they recognize that maybe they can come up with. Laura Clay is a name that has some recognition in the state. She really was synonymous with suffrage. And not just Laura Clay, her whole family. She had several sisters, her mother, all of them involved in suffrage work. They were among the earliest in the state, in the South, the whole region, talking about suffrage and the need for the vote. Now, the reason for their interest is because their husband and father, Cassius Clay, and the actions, the things he's doing to the women in his family that leaves them disgruntled and propels them to investigate suffrage. Cassius Clay, very colorful Kentuckian. A lot of people know him, know some of the stories, tales of him getting involved in duels. He's known for his abolitionist views. He leaves his wife, Mary Jane Warfield Clay, to care for a large household of children while he goes to Russia. He was named ambassador to Russia for a time. He's there during the Civil War. His wife is at home, keeping the home fires burning, does so with great grace and much success. But instead of thanking her when he comes back to the States, he chooses to divorce her. He also, a son returns with him, or at least everyone assumes it to be his Russian son, embarrasses his wife, his daughters. The legal system of Kentucky that favors him and his economic interests. And the Clay women are left with a sour taste in their mouth, to say the least. So his indiscretions are really going to propel Kentucky's suffrage movement here. It's not Laura who's going to be the first Clay woman to get interested in this topic. It's her sister, Mary Barr Clay, the oldest of the daughters. And Mary Barr Clay in the 1870s starts to attend national suffrage meetings. And national leaders right away key in on the Clay women and their interest and the name recognition that they can bring to this movement, because national leaders are trying to get Southerners on board. Southerners have a natural resistance, it seems, to even thinking about this idea of suffrage. For one thing, they tend to be deeply religious. They tend to be pretty conservative in terms of gender norms and upholding the patriarchy. You have other reasons, though, that the South, you have fewer educated women, you have fewer urban women to sort of coalesce together around this issue. But the big glaring issue in the South is race. Southerners fear that if they consider the issue of women's suffrage, they are going to threaten white supremacy. They don't want to reopen the wounds of the war. The 15th Amendment, Southerners looked at that as one of the most horrendous things that had ever happened to them. Hadn't it been bad enough, they say, to enfranchise Black men? Now to think about possibly Black women having the vote too, that was something that they can't even bear really to think about. So Southerners are resistant to this idea, but the Clay women hold the keys really to getting Southern women to at least start opening their mind to this issue. So as soon as Mary Barr Clay expresses interest, national leaders kind of swoop in and say, okay, yeah, we're going to use this as a tool. Susan B. Anthony makes a visit to Kentucky in 1879, anxious to capitalize on the Clay women's interest. But it's Laura who's going to build a viable movement in the state. And one thing that sets Laura apart from her sisters is that she never marries. All of these women, the Clay women, were very talented. They had organization skills. Laura Clay, though, has some more free time than her sisters with their families and their children to care for. Laura Clay is going to build suffrage work into a career. She helps establish the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, and she's going to lead it as she's going to serve as its president for 3 decades. She's also going to build her career nationally as an officer in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. We call it NASA for short. Laura Clay goes all over the country speaking about suffrage. She becomes a household name in the period around the turn of the century, a career here that she has promoting suffrage. So if we go back to this ratification photo and we look at these women, we scan the crowd there, the omission of Laura Clay is glaring. Well, why isn't she there? One could wonder what would stop her from being part of this historic moment of victory. Well, you might ask, was she alive by this point? Yes, she's very much alive. She's alive and disgruntled by 1920. She is not in favor of a 19th Amendment. All of her care colleagues are there. She is not, because by that point, the woman who had given so much of her life to the cause has broken with the organization she has created. Now I'll give you a second to let this sink in and to puzzle for a minute. Well, why would someone so invested in this movement leave it when victory was in sight? Now, I will say, as an author, this provided a wonderful plot twist for me. And in fact, it's where I begin my book, because not only is Laura Clay going to leave the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, she is going to lobby very vigorously and publicly to see the 19th Amendment go down in defeat. She actually travels to Nashville when the end is in sight to try and keep Tennessee from ratifying. So we have to understand why it is that Laura Clay would make the decisions that she's making here. It's a shocking turn of events. The newspapers covered it. People scratching their head, what is going on here? Now, let me emphasize, there you can see a picture in Nashville, anti-ratification headquarters. When Laura Clay gets to Nashville, that's where she reports to assist the anti-suffragists in shooting down this amendment. Let me stress, Laura Clay very badly wants to vote. That is not in question here. It's not that she's changed her mind, thinks women don't deserve the vote. She thoroughly believes that this is the right step. She believes that God made women to be men's equals. She believes that women need to be enfranchised so America can live up to its highest ideals. She knows she's as talented as any man in the state. She has the capabilities that men do, so why should she be denied the vote? She wants full equality. She wants women to be educated. She wants them to hold office, to control their own money, even to preach in the nation's churches. So it's not a question here of the principles behind the vote. Laura Clay's opposition here is directly tied to the way that the vote is being achieved. She does not support the 19th Amendment. Over its 70 years of existence, the suffrage movement had tried out a lot of tactics, a lot of methods here, strategies to win the vote. They'd looked for shortcuts, they'd looked for legal loopholes, anything they could do to win the vote for women. But the two main strategies here, the two possible paths to the vote, were through state action, state amendments to their state constitutions, or through federal action. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, the main national suffrage organization, had pursued both of these paths to victory. But throughout its history, it mainly had prioritized state action. This was seen as easier, a way to avoid some disagreements, to keep Southerners happy, really, when it came down to it. Because for Southerners, state amendments are the only way the vote can be achieved. Louisiana's Kate Gordon is a prime example of this. She is adamantly opposed to a federal amendment, and a very good friend of Clay as time goes on. We see her influence rubbing off on Clay. She hates the idea of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. For one thing, it's named in honor of an abolitionist. That's bad enough. But because she believes it'll reopen this tragic era of Southern history. The wording of the 19th Amendment was identical to the wording of the 15th Amendment, except it talks about gender or sex here instead of race. And for Southerners, the second part of this amendment really is what stuck in their craw. This idea that Congress could enforce this legislation. Southern women are worried about Black women voting. They're worried about federal intrusion here. For them, it was not enough that women win the vote. They must win it in a way that would protect white supremacy. And I don't use those words flippantly. Those are the words they're using. They're not sugarcoating this. They're talking a lot about the strategies to the vote and the ways to protect white supremacy. Now, let me say, Clay had not always been opposed to a federal amendment. She preferred state action, that was clear, but for much of her suffrage career, she believed that any way that they gained the vote would be okay with her. She was a pragmatist. She came from an abolitionist family, in fact, although her racism is going to deepen over time. For Clay, Kentucky had a much smaller Black population. Kate Gordon from Louisiana, she's dealing with a different set of demographics here. But Clay, she looks and she sees there are fewer African Americans, there's less chance that they're really going to shape policy. And so these threats to white supremacy for Clay are a little less alarming than her neighbors further south. Clay likely didn't get too bent out of shape by the idea of a federal amendment for a long time because she never thought it could possibly happen. And many of her fellow suffragists agreed that the 19th Amendment, or it started out the 16th Amendment, a federal amendment was a non-starter in their minds. They believed that Southerners would always line up against it. And if you needed 36 votes to get the amendment ratified, Southerners were always going to block it from happening. Clay believes that. And so, when national leaders are talking about the possibility of a federal amendment, it doesn't worry too much about this. She doesn't think it's a possibility. So Kentucky suffragists, their path to the vote, the one they're pursuing through the movement's long history, is state action. And they were having some success, although very slow success in this strategy. They're going to introduce a suffrage amendment 4 times. Every time the legislature is meeting, every 2 years, they're there lobbying for a state amendment. Every time it's voted down, but they would go back again, optimistic that this time it was going to really happen. The legislature by 1916 had created women's suffrage committees. Both houses of the Kentucky legislature were at least open to considering this issue. And CARA membership in the 19-teens grows spectacularly. You go from having 300 or so members for many, many years. They always hovered around 300, 500. Suddenly in the 19-teens, the Kentucky Suffrage Organization is growing to 16,000, tens of thousands of women now and men signing on to this movement. So Clay and her colleagues are really optimistic that a state amendment could work here. But what's going to stop their momentum and change the tactics is not state level decision making, but national choices that are being made by national leaders. Though NASA had always given less attention to a federal amendment, that changes in 1916. And the reason for that is NASA has new leadership, a new president. Actually, she's coming back for a second term in office. Carrie Chapman Catt, a colleague of Clay's. They went way, way back. They'd known each other for years. Carrie Chapman Catt becomes president of NASA. And by the 19-teens, she's tired of going down the same roads and trying the same old tired methods. And she is going to introduce a new plan, a winning plan, she called it. And she demands that state suffrage organizations fall in line with the national agenda. No longer would it be a do your own thing kind of model. Now they would get their orders from on high. She would call the shots. All their attention moving forward is going to be directed toward a federal amendment. Well, this does not sit well with Laura Clay at all. She's outraged and she decides to fight back. She tries to get her CARA colleagues on board to support her break with the national, to go their own way, to ignore what Catt is asking them to do and to do their own thing. Clay, by this point, was no longer president of CARA. She had been followed. She'd sort of picked her handpicked successor, Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, and Madeline McDowell Breckinridge had been followed by Clay's niece. So Clay, even though she's not leading this organization anymore, she has a lot of authority and a lot of influence. And so these Kentucky suffragists find themselves in a terrible position. In this picture, you can see Laura Clay. She's at the very center of the shot there with other women from the state at one of the political conventions. I think they're at the Republican convention in 1916. But Laura Clay is urging Kentucky suffragists to ignore the orders being passed down from on high and to do their own thing. And these Kentucky suffragists, they respect Clay, but they don't like the idea of going against the national. In fact, many of them see a federal amendment as having a lot of potential here for finally getting this job done, especially Louisville women. These Louisville women that are now flooding into the organization. They're taking positions on the CARA board, and they don't see this as a problem that Laura Clay sees it to be. They think this is all splitting hairs, and so they're okay with a federal amendment. And it sets up a situation, a very tense situation in CARA for what comes next. In the organization, they're actually able to paper over their differences for a little while. You have the war intervening, a distraction. You have the flu, the Spanish flu. And so that is helping to divert some of the attention from their disagreements. But finally, CARA is going to have to take a stand, and they back the federal amendment. This is going to lead CARA to fracture. Laura Clay goes her own way. And that's when you see the news coverage. Laura Clay ending her association with CARA. She establishes an alternate organization. She called it the Citizens Committee for a State Suffrage Amendment. Only 3 of her colleagues join her. So that shows something about where the organization stood by this point. Laura Clay doesn't have the backing of her colleagues, but she is going to have nothing to do with the 19th Amendment. And she's going to make it as hard on state and national suffragists as she possibly can. Ratification, of course, is going to succeed. It's going to succeed in Clay's own state of Kentucky. Clay is going to end up a voter. And she is going to vote. She's going to vote in 1920, even though she had been so adamantly opposed to gaining the vote this way. She does vote. And in fact, she's going to run for office later on. So the burning question here, and a question that I address in my book, is what propels Laura Clay to do this? Why does she end up standing against a reform that she had supported for so long? And the easy answer to this question is she's racist. Her racial views lead her in this direction. She's concerned with protecting white supremacy to the point that she will forego voting herself if it means Black women won't get to either. There's no doubt Clay sees the world through racist eyes. I said over time, her racism hardened, particularly in the 20th century. She led an organization that was completely white. She had no interest in interracial work or allowing Black women to participate in the Kentucky suffrage movement. When she goes to Nashville, she teams up with the most blatantly racist anti-suffragists that you can imagine. And this poster here, put out by these anti-suffragists, talking about the dangers, what will happen if women get the right to vote through a 19th Amendment. Laura Clay endorses this. She signs on with these racists. And what's important to note here is that the suffrage movement all across the country, not just in Kentucky, it's always about race as is as much about gender. So racism is a big part of it for Laura Clay. But there are other factors too. I don't have time to go into them. I talk about them in the book. It's a really interesting situation, I think, the forces that lead her to make the decisions that she does, but race, a very important part of it. The vote here, an important victory for America, for American women, but the story of how it is won doesn't always reveal us in a positive light. It doesn't reveal decision-making that endorses America's highest ideals. It was in no way simple, and a continued betrayal of justice in some important ways. So as we celebrate suffrage and as new scholarship has come out, we've really highlighted the complexities of this movement and how it wasn't simple. Racism, class division, self-interest all play a role here. After all, it's a human story and humans are flawed. But the human element of it, I think, provides a lot of opportunity for us to learn from it, to take the lessons forward into the future. So I'll turn it back over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, and I know we've had some compliments and some really great questions in the chat already, so we'll jump right in. Wondering, the first question that came in was wondering, what was Laura Clay's source of income that allowed her to devote herself so fully to this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. She's coming from privilege, and an aunt had left her some money, actually left to her mother, that then it passes down to her. That's how her housing, it was an aunt's house that she inherited. But also a lot of her resources are coming through her father. Her father, before he died, he divided the farm up in Whitehall. If you've ever visited Whitehall in Richmond, he divided that among his children, daughters, and sons. And so she had a 300+ acre farm, and she considers herself as a professional farmer. She would have never said that. I guess suffrage is a career for her, but she has a second career because she is a farmer as well, a professional farmer. She has overseers that are running the farm, but she makes a lot of the decisions and is doing a lot of the mind work behind the farm. So that's how she's supporting herself.
Got a couple of questions that I'm going to try and merge into one. All of them have to do with the geography of suffrage support within Kentucky. You mentioned Louisville having a slow start in the suffrage movement. I wondered if you could talk about the regions that were sort of first ahead. And then another question, moving outside of the cities, how does this support filter out into the rural counties of the state?
Yeah, the thing I quickly discovered about suffrage was that there are tremendous regional differences, and you can see this on a national level between different states, how they consider the movement and participate in it, but also within states and different regions. And in the case of Louisville, there's early interest, 1890, Susan Look Avery, I showed her picture. She is holding the first organizational meeting in Louisville. I believe it's 1890 or 1891. So very early. And there's interest for a few months, years. It kind of ebbs and flows. But it depended a lot on the leadership that was available. And Susan Look Avery would go north for a portion of every year. And so things kind of the interest would dwindle, and women who were involved would get involved in other causes. Susan Look Avery had her finger in multiple pies, and she had all these issues she was pursuing. And so she would kind of get distracted, and other issues would dominate her attention for a while. And so it's not until the 19 teens, and CARA and the national organization holds the National Convention in Louisville in 1911, and that really propels the growth. But it's because a lot of women in Louisville start to see this not just as the right to vote, but the right to vote connected to all kinds of other issues that they're interested in. And so progressive reform is sweeping the country, sweeping the city, and they want to go out there and end child labor and make things better for women, factory workers. And so they're using the vote, they're positioning it as a way to achieve their larger goals. Now, other parts of the state, Western Kentucky, I found in a lot of counties and regions, race tended to influence participation there a lot more than it did in Louisville. Also, temperance was a big issue. And in very religious communities, a lot of times you'd have ministers who would line up and say, this is a terrible idea in women. If you're pursuing suffrage, this is going against God's will. And so depending on the makeup of the community and who's in leadership positions and the newspaper support, there could be a variety of reasons why you have more interest in some areas than others.
Wondering what we know about African-American women who are organizing for the vote alongside these white leaders.
Yeah, this has been a question that a lot of the new scholarship coming out on the vote has been really concerned with addressing. And in my book and several others that have books that have really made a splash coming out, looking at race and addressing its role in this movement, have argued that Black women are very much interested in the vote, but often they're putting their attention, their organization, their activism is being directed in other directions. And that's definitely the case here in Kentucky. And I think part of it is they were so firmly rejected from CARA. I mean, there's no route for them to become involved, at least in the national suffrage organizing that's going on in this state. And there are a few white suffragists who are more amenable to that. And there are some brief efforts to cross racial lines and work together. It's always still kind of patronizing the way that white leaders are suggesting this, but Laura Clay is firmly opposed to this because she sees it as a killer for the movement. It's just going to kill white women's interest in it. And so she keeps Black women out of the movement. Black women in Kentucky are very much organized, though. They're organized to defeat the separate car laws that are segregating trains in public transportation. They're organizing, they're speaking out against lynching, they're organizing, they're banding together to create educational organizations, religious groups. They're involved, but not directly, pointedly making suffrage one of their main priorities because they have bigger fish to fry. They have more immediate pressing problems. And that's really the case all over the country. Although you do see pockets. I know someone has written a history of suffrage in Indiana, and she has found that actually there's a lot of Black women involved in Indiana's movement. So, you know, state over here, we see a very different picture.
It's really fascinating. We have a question that stems from one of the people that we called out in the signing photo, Alice B Castleman. And in Louisville nowadays, you can't mention the word Castleman without dredging up all of these questions about the tensions between legacies of Southern history and this era of progressive reform. Can you tell us a little bit more about Alice's work?
Yeah, and I should have gone back and refreshed because I'm dealing with hundreds of women here. And there have been several good short biographical sketches if anyone's interested in getting a much more detailed view of the Castleman women and their participation. But of course, their ties to Civil War, Confederate side here were very well known in the suffrage movement. And they are often, these women are pulled into working for suffrage because of some of those Confederate memorial ties, these women's organizations. But the Castleman women will be very active in Louisville trying to further this movement. One thing I know that they were known for was helping to organize a parade in Louisville. I believe it's 1913, and it's very soon after the national Alice Paul and other national figures organized the march in Washington, D.C. around Woodrow Wilson's inaugural. Louisville women say, oh, we need to do something similar here in Kentucky, which is a pretty bold move because parades, that was not taken lightly. You march in a parade. A lot of people say that's not feminine, it's unseemly. Women should not be doing this kind of public display. And the Castleman women say, no, we need to do this here in Louisville. We need to have our own parade and organize one that is really quite successful and help to build the Louisville movement.
Got a really good question here. So the anchor of Southern resistance to the amendment is sort of settled in racism. Of course, that amazing photo of Laura Clay going down there to Nashville with the Confederate flag, and I'm presuming a Confederate veteran seated there, which is just stunning imagery. But the question relates to the anti-suffrage support in the North, where there isn't a Confederacy to latch on to, and this legacy of states' rights. But I'm sort of mentioning a number of prominent supporters of anti-suffrage movement in the North. What are their arguments based in, and how do they differ from those in the South?
Well, Southerners have pointed out, and certainly studies of racism within the wider American movement have noted that Northern women often would pay lip service to the fact that the movement should be more egalitarian and less racist, and sort of shook their fingers at Southerners, while they really backed these same ideas and used Southerners as their vehicle. They're going to pin their racism on Southerners, but they share in the racism as well. Northerners, though, too, for them, a primary issue is keeping immigrants out and immigrant women. And what you see a lot of times is when suffrage reforms are passed, especially by the 19-teens, they're attached to literacy requirements. And that's a way in the South to keep Black women out. In the North, it's a way to keep immigrant women out. So it's not just here racism in terms of Black, white. This is anti-democratic in a number of ways, really, when you look at it. And partly, I think it's expediency. There are some national leaders who would have rather said, no, universal suffrage is the only way to go, and we have to stand true to it. But they're willing to compromise some of their their ideals and principles because they want to get it passed, and they don't feel like they can without taking some steps here to placate the more racist elements of society.
Wondering, you had some really excellent pictures there of Laura Clay going out nationwide to these conventions and organizations and meetings that were presumably gatherings of women and men supporters from all over the country and maybe even internationally. We had a question about wondering if those meetings ever came to Louisville, anything on a national or an international scale, or to Kentucky generally, and what sort of impact does that have on the local movement when those things come to town?
Yeah, that's the Louisville movement really takes off. Exponential growth happens after 1911. And that's when the National decides to host its meeting in Louisville. There had been other efforts in Louisville in, I think it's in the 1880s. I can't name the exact year, but before the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a cumbersome name because it's two organizations that united. One of those early suffrage organizations had a meeting in Louisville. I think it's the American Women's Suffrage Association had hosted a convention. And that was seen as a way to get Southerners interested and introduce the idea to them. It certainly was used in a targeted way when the 1911 convention happens in Louisville. And sometimes the state organization also would choose where to host its convention. They played around with the idea at one point of having it in Madisonville, Kentucky, because there was a pocket of women they really were hoping to energize and get excited there. And so often they would even sacrifice. They'd know that their numbers would go way down, but it was a political decision. It was a decision, an enrollment kind of recruitment decision to get new blood into the movement.
That's really fascinating. We did just post Dr. Goan's email address in the chat. We are coming right up on time, so unless I get another question here in, I think we're gonna wrap up. So thank you all for the really wonderful questions from the audience. Thank you, Dr. Goan. This is a really enjoyable lecture.
Well, thank you for having me.